the deal with the UK is fairly limited in scope and may be tough to replicate with other countries, especially those with a large trade deficit with the U.S. Remember, the U.S. is running out about an $11 billion surplus with the UK right now. Now, talks are still ongoing, but overnight, the European Union, the EU, unveiled plans to slap tariffs on $107 billion of U.S. goods, including American cars, auto parts, airplanes, and other products, if negotiations with the U.S. break down. But President Trump is still optimistic that he can clinch more trade deals in the months ahead, telling reporters that he expects good talks between the U.S. and China in Switzerland over the weekend. Take a listen.
Scott's going to be going to Switzerland, meeting with China, and they very much want to make a deal. We can all play games. Who made the first call? Who didn't make the? It doesn't matter. It only matters what happens in that room. But I will tell you that China very much wants to make a deal. We'll see how that works out.
All right, let's bring in someone who knows more than a little bit about trade. Carlos Gutierrez joins us, former U.S. Commerce Secretary, also the former CEO of Kellogg. Mr. Secretary, great to see you, and always appreciate your time on the show.
Thank you.
First I wanted to ask you, whether you were surprised that this first deal is being done with the U.K., because as Sherry suggested, there had been a lot of chatter that maybe India was first off the cap queue. But if it hadn't happened with the UK, the U.S.'s closest ally, that would have been strange, right?
Yeah, I agree with what Sherry said. A lot of surprise about the fact that it was the UK. We were all expecting India, perhaps even Japan, but the UK in a sense has been underway since Brexit, and back then, there was a lot of discussion about the strategic nature of an agreement between the UK and the US. It probably is the easiest agreement to make. We have a trade surplus with the UK, which makes it a lot less friction, a lot less of a discussion, an anxious discussion, when we've got, in a sense, the upper hand, if you look at it from the standpoint of surplus or deficit. So I don't want to minimize it. This is an important step forward. The market was very generous and ready to give the president the benefit of the doubt. But there's a lot more to come. This is as we know, this is a kind of a conceptual term sheet. So from here on, this is when the real negotiations happen. It's going to take a lot of time. These things don't happen quickly. It could take 12 months. But the specter of tariffs will continue to hang over the negotiations.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, apparently I was talking to Sherry about how apparently there are about 100 countries lined up right now talking to the U.S. about doing deals, and in that 90-day time frame, we're not going to get 100 done. It's just totally unrealistic, right? But I'm just curious whether you think that the U.S. can and maybe should be focusing on the core 8 or 9 allies and partners which are most crucial to U.S. interests, and among them are Asian countries, South Korea, for example, Japan, India, Mexico, Canada. Do you think that is the focus? Do you think it should be the focus?
Yeah, and the administration has said so. Today, Secretary Ludnick said, we're going to get the 100 done by July 8th, which is when the temporary freeze of the tariff expires. I think focusing on the top 18, they've talked about 18, is the right way to go. I think if we get 18, call it term sheets, I think that will be received in a very positive fashion by the markets. That would be a major victory. I think the president would be very pleased. So, instead of shooting for 100 or claiming that we're going to have 100, if they're able to get these 18 done, and again, it would be a framework of a deal, it wouldn't be a total trade agreement, that would be a major win. And the markets will give the president a lot of credit for that. And I hope that they're focused on precisely that.
Mr. Secretary, are you expecting much out of Geneva this weekend at all when the USTR, Jameson Greer, and also, of course, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, sit down with key Chinese officials, including their top negotiator, He Lifeng, there? Or is it just good enough, right, that we are having these high-level talks and contacts?
Well, it's a great start. And the fact that the two countries are meeting is a major message to investors. China is the number one issue. If you look at the tariffs, 145%, there are small businesses who are already feeling the crunch. We're going to start seeing out of stocks over the next 2 weeks, empty shelves, shortages. And it took a while to get started, but in a similar fashion, it's going to take a while to undo what has been put in place. So I would expect that the best to come out of this weekend would be a reduction in the tariff levels from 145 down, from 125 down. If it were 50, that would be a wonderful outcome. That would be, for me, the best case. But as you said, the important thing is that this has started. What I think China should keep in mind is that President Trump likes bold deals. He likes big moves. An ordinary traditional trade agreement is not really of attraction to him. So because he wants bold moves, China should see this in an expansive way, to expand the scope. They could achieve potentially geopolitical benefits from this. So I hope it gets started. I hope we can reach an agreement, at least on trade. But I also believe that China should see this as a major opportunity and not a defensive move.
Exactly a month ago, Mr. Secretary, when we had you on, you were saying that China is not going to easily back down because this is really a matter that ties into the national pride. How do you assess the developments so far over the past 4 weeks or so in terms of how the U.S. administration has been handling it and how the emotions have been really evolving in China as well?
Well, you heard the president say today that he knows that China wants a deal. And in terms of the emotion, that is important, right? That China really wants a deal with the U.S. President Xi has managed this in a very clever way. At no point has China shown a lack of patience or a desire to get to the table. They've been very patient. There haven't been any signals of desperation. In fact, when someone in the U.S. said we're already talking to China, it was President Xi or someone in the Chinese government who said, no, we haven't started discussions. So they've played it very well, and they've played it with a lot of patience, a view towards the long term. So the important thing will be what they actually accomplish this weekend. But this is not going to happen with threats on both sides. Both presidents will react poorly to threats, to trying to up each other, who gave in, who didn't, who wanted the deal. I think from here on, privacy is important. And this will be a test for the Trump administration because privacy is not something that characterizes this administration. It's been very transparent with the media, but privacy will help the deal move forward.
But from your experience as a former U.S. Commerce Secretary, does it really not matter who wanted this deal, who called who first? And obviously, President Trump is not making things anything private at this point, as you point out. How does it matter? How would it affect the dialogue going forward?
Actually, these statements are more for domestic consumption. President Trump doesn't want to give the impression to his constituency that he's desperate for a deal, that he may have gone too far on tariffs. And likewise, I don't think President Xi wants to convey to his constituents, to his public, that China is also giving in. So that is more for domestic consumption. I think once we get to the table, the one thing that can hold back is this notion that whatever is said will be public. And I know that many world leaders will be very careful about that. So again, I think discipline here, if Secretary Bessent can commit to keeping things private, perhaps an announcement by the president that talks are going well, that we're looking at certain areas, that we're looking at reducing certain tariffs, that would be good. but the more detail we get into about who wanted the deal and whether China is willing to give a lot, I think that can hold back the talks. So the more we talk about it, the less likely a good deal would be.
Mr. Secretary, you probably agree that, if and when there is a deal to be done with China, they're going to want to basically go to town with it and publicize it as much as they can as a win for the United States. That's sort of consistent with the way the Trump administration has been doing things, right? But, this whole idea of art of the deal and starting with a maximalist position to maybe scare people or get them on the back foot and then bargaining down from there, we know about that. You mentioned that the president likes big, grand sort of deals, right? So indulge me here with in the sort of thought exercise, right? You talked about tariffs coming down, and there's been a lot of chatter they could maybe potentially more than halve from 145 down to maybe even in the 40s or at least 50s, right? In addition to that, China, let's say, buys more soybeans, more Boeings, more corn. How much bigger conceivably could this get? Could it involve the U.S. allowing China to invest in the U.S., say BYD, building a car factory in China with sufficient guardrails, of course, right? And potentially even the U.S. giving China a pass on Taiwan. Do you think that the president is thinking that big?
I wouldn't discard any of that. That would be what you said about automobiles. We want automobiles to be manufactured in the U.S. It's not just about coming back to the U.S., but having new investment in the U.S. That would be a sign that the times are changing. If an agreement can be reached to allow China to make an investment in the U.S. to manufacture automobiles, that could be a dream, and it may not even be near an agreement. But in terms of bold and doing something new, something that breaks through, that would be very big. And I believe the president can sell that. I don't think he would, he would look weak. I think he can actually sell it to his base. On Taiwan, there's a lot that can be done. Reduce the rhetoric. The U.S. can make a public statement that we don't support Taiwan independence. There's a spectrum of things. And I don't think that is so critical to President Trump that he would allow it to be an obstacle to better relations with China. This is an opportunity for him to be, say, the Richard Nixon of the 21st century. And he sees it that way. He sees it as an opportunity to not just to have things go back to the way they were, but to have a new chapter, a new book in the relationship between China and the U.S., a historic agreement.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. And we've got more to go on about. And of course, Carlos Gutierrez, the former U.S. Commerce Secretary, is staying with us for another block here. So thank you very much. We will continue our chat with him just a bit later. And still ahead on Squawk Box Asia, the Cardinals have voted and they have chosen their first American-born pontiff to be the next pope. More about Pope Leo XIV later in the show. Stick around. We're back with Carlos Gutierrez, a former U.S. Commerce Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I mean, the timing is quite impeccable right before the U.S.-China trade negotiations in Geneva this weekend. We are getting somewhat of a usual narrative. Do you see anything different that we should consider as a key takeaway from this China-Russia meeting?
Well, I think there's an attempt to make the relationship as strong as possible. Now they're calling it a relationship made of steel, unbreakable. And I think that's the message that is being portrayed, is this is a rock-solid relationship and no one is going to break it up. Obviously, Russia doesn't have the same economic stake as China, so the interests are a bit different. The key thing here is whether President Putin eventually cooperates on a peace deal with Ukraine, and eventually what does the president do if that becomes elusive. If President Putin just does not want to come to the table, then the president has a decision to make, and it'll be interesting to see what China's response is. I don't think that China will use this for strategic purposes. I think China is too wise for that. Yes, they're friendly with Russia, but the stake here for China is a lot greater. I don't think that they will fall on their sword for something like Russia and Ukraine, but I think that's what's at stake here. And the message is we are closer than ever.
We actually had a guest on a couple of weeks ago describing his anticipation of this, what he called a fortress economy. Basically, the world divided up into three different forces, the U.S. on one side and Europe, with Russia sort of in charge, and China and the rest of the Asia as well. Is this really the critical moment where we're talking about trade and tariffs, but is this really the key moment of major decoupling? Not just the G2, but into more bigger pieces, or more pieces, I should say.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's a scenario. I don't think it's the most probable scenario. If you look at 3-4 weeks ago, it looked like what President Trump was doing was initiating a process of decoupling by putting a 145% tariff on China. That suggests we don't want to do business with China. So that also gives importance to the fact that they're meeting this weekend. I don't see Russia playing a big role in economically, perhaps militarily. I think they would like to be the major player in Europe. But there is a scenario where you start seeing more regionalization. Asia is pretty much a region today, and it's being cemented even more. Europe, of course, it's its own region. I don't know if the president has in mind as one of his goals to regionalize North America or even the Americas, but just starting with North America. The idea that an investment in Mexico is good for the U.S. because it's in North America. So there's still some way to go to see the world breaking up that way. The fact that the president wants to cut these 18 deals or these 100 deals, that he's moving forward in order to bring down these reciprocal tariffs, suggests that there could be an alternative scenario where we continue to see a certain amount of global trade. But yes, regionalization is a reality, and it's happening in Asia and definitely in Europe.
President Trump is such a visit the Middle East. Many were saying that he just likes to go there because he feels really, relatively speaking, more welcomed there as well. But what do you expect him to get out of this trip? And do you think that it will be different this time around in terms of the Gulf states' mantra that they don't have to really choose sides?
I think what a lot of people are, at least what I'm looking at, is whether there is an agreement made reference to in regards to oil production. We know that President Trump wants to get prices down. He has already pointed to oil prices beginning to come down. He will not be concerned about oil producers having to produce at $50 a barrel. He wants these prices to come down. He wants to be able to point to the fact that his energy policy is working. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some announcement regarding Saudi production. Things were said last week that suggest that Saudi is continuing to keep the current rate of production. That would be a big announcement for President Trump. It would be a victory for President Trump. And that's the kind of agreement that I would be looking forward to.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, a couple of minutes ago you were talking about how you thought President Trump aspires to be like Nixon in terms of opening up a brand new chapter in the relationship with China. A lot of folks have been talking about Trump potentially trying to do a reverse Nixon, which is to peel Russia away from China and try and split them. But as we were talking about that Xi visit to Moscow with this whole friendship friends of steel now, that seems less and less likely. But look, I want to move away from grand strategy and get you to talk to us about personal diplomacy, because that seems to be President Trump's brand, right? And in your life, you've done a lot of things, right? Commerce Secretary, you've been, king of cornflakes, you used to run Kellogg's, and you also started a very interesting company called Empath. Not sure whether you're still involved in that or not, but it essentially is about improving human relationships or personal relationships. If you could put your empath hat on right now, what kind of advice would you give both President Trump and President Xi?
Well, I sold Empath last year, but we were in the business of identifying skills, which essentially is, a lot of it is what we call power skills, right? Getting along with people, intuition, empathy. And one thing to keep in mind about President Trump is that one of his great skills is interpersonal intuition. He reads people well. And importantly, he reads weaknesses. So, and I'm sure that the Chinese and many other countries have analyzed this. But what you can't do is show weakness. And it's a balance, right? Because you don't want to show strength to the point where you reject any transaction. But that is one thing about Trump, is his interpersonal intuition. He feels people. He has a sense of where he can push and where people are vulnerable and where he can gain more. So I would say that's probably front and center. President Xi, I don't doubt that he has similar skills, but he will be looking at it more institutionally, more in the sense of China in 10 years, China in 20 years. President Trump will see it very much as a Trump negotiation and a Trump deal. This is not going to be solved by an agreement that something will happen in 10 years.